Welcome to the Success Talk Show, the podcast for ambitious leaders who want to get their best results and create a workplace for their teams to thrive. Each week, we share practical advice to help you accelerate your success and grow as an inspiring leader. Now, here's your host, Leadership Success Coach, Donna Siriani.
Welcome to another episode of the Success Talk Show. This is Donna Siriani, Leadership Success Coach and founder of Success Compass Academy. On this episode, I'll be sharing with you what I've learned about what executive presence is and why it matters. And I'll share specific tips with you for how you can strengthen your own executive presence. So first, let's take a quick look at what it is. Now think of someone who you believe has strong executive presence. What qualities come to mind when you think of that person? What words would you use to describe those qualities? Now, when I think of senior leaders that I've worked with through the years, a couple of people come to mind right away when I think of answering this question for myself. And there's one scenario that has stayed with me for many years, and I want to share it with you. I had started working for a tech company, and within the first week, I attended a management retreat with, maybe it was like 30 or 40 senior leaders. And I've never forgotten the contrast between two specific presentations. My boss gave one of them, and one of the regional executives gave the other one. And the purpose of these two presentations was that we were about to launch a really big corporate initiative, and we needed to get support from everyone in the room. Now, my boss had maybe, conservatively, 30 or 40 PowerPoint slides that had really excruciating details in them, very, very detailed slides. And he planned to go through almost every square inch of what he prepared. He scripted his presentation. He did want to cover all the facts, all the content, and he was really concerned about getting it all out there. He delivered his presentation. I would have to say it was somewhat of a monotone tone of voice. Definitely seemed nervous. This wasn't a crowd that he presented to often. So it was somewhat of a strenuous presentation. Now, the second presentation was a senior leader. He presented on the same topic, immediately followed my boss. But to contrast, he was relaxed, charismatic, articulate, had really positive energy when he spoke, highly engaging, really interesting, very strategic, didn't get into the weeds, and he really got our attention. Now, how many PowerPoint slides do you think he used? He only had one slide, and we were on the edge of our seat. We wanted to hear what he had to say. Now, the contrast between these two presentations, as I mentioned, kind of always stood out in my mind. So I want to share with you the best definition of executive presence that I have found so far. And it's this, that executive presence is the qualities of a leader that engage, inspire, align, and move people to act. And this is from Suzanne Bates. She's the CEO of Bates Communications, and it's from her book, All the Leader You Can Be, The Science of Achieving Extraordinary Executive Presence. Now, what I love about this definition is that it's simple but powerful in capturing the essence of what executive presence is and why it matters. So in terms of your role as a leader, when you hear this definition, how important is it to you personally to have the qualities that enable you to engage, inspire, align, and move people to act? How important is this to you? What's your vision for the impact that you'd personally like to have in your organization? Or maybe the impact you'd like to have in your industry or with your clients? And how would you like to advance your career? Do you want or aspire to more senior levels of leadership? Now, if the answer to this question is yes, I want to have greater impact, I do want to grow and advance to more senior levels, then you can answer for yourself why executive presence would matter, right? If this is what you want to accomplish, because it really does depend on what your specific goals are. Executive presence won't matter to everyone, but if you really want to be that inspiring, engaging leader, then I want to share with you some tips today for how you can further strengthen your own executive presence. So let's take a look at some specific skills. Now, when I've researched executive presence and various models, I would say more than half the behaviors that are always cited tend to be also emotional intelligence skills. So rather than introduce new language to you, I just want to refer back to the specific EQ skills that do correlate to executive presence. So, I would argue that all 15, if I look at the entire set of EQ skills, I would argue all 15 help you build strong executive presence. But there are 7 that I'm going to list here because they really relate specifically to executive presence. And I've already recorded podcasts on these. So rather than go into the details on tips for each one, I'm just going to highlight them briefly. And then I'll share with you where you can get more information. So the first 2 EQ skills I want to highlight are emotional self-awareness and emotional expression. And you can find tips on these 2 in my podcast episode number 8. Now, I put these 2 at the top of the list because when you thought about a leader who has strong executive presence, maybe the words you would have used to describe them could be that they're calm, cool, collected. And so emotional self-awareness and emotional expression are crucial for you to come across as having that calm disposition, being very reasonable, avoiding sort of emotional extremes of highs or lows where you sort of burst into an emotional tirade without having that pause to consider how you're coming across to others. So it starts with first being aware of how you're reacting and feeling emotionally to what's happening, and then gauging what the situation is and acting accordingly, which is emotional expression. It's your words, it's your body language, your tone of voice. So emotional expression is extremely important. And I put that at the top of the list because typically some of the first words that most people will use when they describe executive presence is that demeanor, that physical demeanor when you are working with somebody who has that strong presence. Okay. Those are the first 2. The next one I want to mention is assertiveness. Now, you can find tips on assertiveness in my podcast, episode number 11. And assertiveness is such an important part of executive presence because you certainly won't have that commanding presence if you are passive, you don't really speak up at all, you're very agreeable, but you're not advocating for your own point of view. And if you're too aggressive, where you really come across, I always say, if you come across too much like a bully, well, that's not what executive presence is either. You want to be calmly in the middle, advocating for your point of view, sharing your opinions, asserting them in a very calm way. But you need to be assertive. You need to have backbone and speak up for you or your team and so on. So assertiveness was number 3. The 4th one I want to mention is stress tolerance, and you can find tips on that in episode number 15. Now, stress tolerance should be pretty obvious too, because normally executive presence, it's being calm and decisive in the face of a crisis, right? No matter what's going on, that feeling of overwhelm or tough situation, you are able to be the voice of reason. Be objective, be calm, controlled, decisive, manage in a potentially emotional situation, and you have strategies for how you deal with that. So again, you come across with that executive presence. You're somebody that other people will trust and respect for how you handle a situation because you're always in control, okay? So stress tolerance. The next one is self-regard. Episode number 7, you can find more about self-regard and tips for that. But it's you showing that you understand your own strengths and weaknesses. You are authentic. You have your own style. You know what you're good at. And that really fuels your self-confidence. So if you think about, again, go back to who you're thinking about as somebody that has executive presence, they come across as being very confident and very authentic. They're comfortable in their own shoes. They know what they're good at, and they know what their weaknesses are. So instead of overcommitting, agreeing to things that they know don't play to their strengths, they know those are weaknesses, they would have the confidence to delegate, negotiate for those to be handled in a different way. They have strategies of how to handle that. You will see them typically operating in the areas where they're strongest. And that way they can be more authentic and step into that style. Again, they're comfortable in their own shoes. Now, number 6 is reality testing, and you can find out more tips on that one in episode 13. But reality testing is somebody who has executive presence. They really know how to bring objectivity into a conversation or a critical decision. In fact, I remember, one executive, came to mind of a group of us leaders were in a room trying to figure out what to do on a particular project. And the senior person in the room, who was the highest level executive, he was able to be that voice of reason, bring in some data and say, wait a minute, let me create the context here. He could set directions, set the priorities. He brought the objective view, the objective data, when the rest of us maybe had some difficulty reaching a decision. So you want to be able to do that reality check. Be the person who can bring objectivity to the room. Now, the last one I'll mention is empathy. And empathy comes across all the time. And it's actually, you can find out more about empathy in episode number 12. But it's you actually being able to see things from someone else's point of view. Now, you don't have to agree with them, but you need to show an interest in what they have to say, what their viewpoints are, be open, listen. And this is true regardless of whether you're influencing, negotiating, presenting, collaborating. Regardless of the situation, empathy will be one of those crucial skills for coming across as someone who authentically has executive presence. Now, I would argue all 15 emotional intelligence skills in some way all contribute to your executive presence, but those are the 7 that have a stronger correlation. So I've given you the podcast episodes where you can go back, and if any one of these in particular you feel is an area for you to strengthen, you can go back and listen to those episodes for more in-depth tips. But for right now, I want to give you a few tips for steps that you can take to build your own executive presence. So the first one I actually just gave you. Tip number 1 is reflect on the qualities that I've mentioned so far in this podcast. And if any of them resonated with you, think about where you might want to improve. Okay, so you've got to reflect on this. Tip number 2, I encourage you to ask a trusted colleague or advisor for feedback on your executive presence. Now, how I would do that is, pick a couple of people that, again, like, and trust. You really trust and value their feedback. And what I would ask them is this question: what are 3 things I could do to improve my executive presence? Just that one simple question. Now, the reason I say 3 is because, in my opinion, it's easier for that person to give you feedback when you say, give me 3 things. They might say, you want to build your confidence, you come across maybe as a little too shy, and so on. But it allows them to mention 3 things and not get stuck on and overanalyzing what's the one thing you need to do. If you ask them for 3, chances are you will get richer feedback than if you said, just name the one thing. That's a little bit heavier of a question. So I found that when you ask for 3, you'll get richer information back from a trusted colleague or advisor. Now, tip number 3, personally, I'm a huge advocate for formal 360 feedback assessments because I believe you get better data from a wider audience and with anonymity. Really putting somebody a little bit on the hot seat when it's face-to-face and you're waiting with bated breath to hear what they have to say to you can be a little bit difficult. But if it's somebody you're really close to, hopefully they will be free with their candid feedback. But I really am an advocate for 360 feedback assessments. So if you have access to that, certainly I use assessments with my clients, and you certainly could reach out to me for that. But that's really your best way to get feedback. Tip number 4 is use the data you've collected, whether it's in person, through an email, through an assessment. Use that data to then formulate a set of goals with an action plan. And this could be really simple. It could be you talk to 2 or 3 people about feedback, you've got some tips, you've got 4 or 5 things, or maybe they've all said the same thing, and now you just pick one thing, pick 1 or 2 things that's an area that really stands out for you that you could begin working on right away to just make some immediate improvements, and just maybe for the next few months, like the next 3 to 6 months, just concentrate on those couple of items, okay? Now, I've said in other episodes, you make more traction when you just pick a couple of things, give yourself plenty of time to work on that. Now, tip number 5 is something I have not mentioned at all yet, but you absolutely need to consider your appearance. Are you dressing for the level that you're aspiring to? Or are you dressing in a way that shows you're serious about how you reflect the brand or culture of your organization? Now, I haven't mentioned it before because this is something that it's absolutely important. I would not equate it at all to the emotional intelligence skills that we've covered. That's really where I'd start. But you really cannot disregard how important your appearance is because it's a reflection of being thoughtfully organized about how you present yourself. Now, we'd like to think, well, what difference does it make what I'm wearing and my choices, wardrobe choices? But it absolutely matters. Studies show no matter what we would like to think, first impressions matter, and it does have an impact. Now, in all the years that I have spent in corporate, even though it was not openly discussed, it was discussed behind closed doors over and over again, how leaders really across the whole organization really did care about how their key leaders were presenting themselves, because whether it was their clothing, being organized, neat appearance, etc., their style. So when they would choose who's going to go out and give that client presentation, who's going to lead that discussion group at the next advisory group meeting, or who will we even invite to the meeting, appearance matters. So I didn't want to have that be the headline for this episode, but it's something you really do need to think about. Okay. So you may want to ask for feedback on that, and just, sometimes people, men and women, will candidly go out and, get some help, right? If it's an area that they don't have a lot of strength in how to build their wardrobe. Now, tip number 6, and this is my last tip, is identify someone who you greatly admire in terms of their executive presence. Notice what they're doing that you believe is effective. You admire them, you respect what they're doing, and it really helps to have a role model because you can observe, see them in action, see how they conduct themselves, and depending on who they are in your relationship to them, you may want to talk to them and get some tips from them. But it does help to have a role model. So that's my last tip. So if you found this episode helpful, I would love to hear from you. You can go into iTunes, click on ratings and reviews, and leave a review. Would love to get your feedback. And before you leave, click the subscribe button on iTunes so that you will be receiving the weekly podcast series. Now, if you prefer video, you can jump over to YouTube, search for Donna Siriani, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and you'll automatically receive weekly video tips. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.